Hello, my friends. We are still in the middle of an escalating crisis between the United States and a cluster of European NATO members, principally over Denmark and Greenland. European officials keep issuing brave, declaratory statements about standing with Denmark and standing with Greenlanders. But beneath the rhetoric, the real story is hesitation, fragmentation, and fear, especially from one government that matters greatly in Northwest Europe, Britain. Keir Starmer has been remarkably cautious, almost studiously so. He avoids strong statements that might sound openly critical of the United States, and he is extremely careful not to endorse, even indirectly, any meaningful retaliatory steps against Washington. This reticence matters because Britain is not some peripheral voice in European security. It is one of the few European states that still tries to present itself as a strategic actor, and it has worked relentlessly for years to stay glued to Washington's agenda. Now that agenda has turned into an internal Western quarrel, and London is instinctively doing what it always does, minimizing risk to the transatlantic relationship, even if that means leaving Denmark hanging in the wind. I should add a necessary caveat about Trump's tariff threats. With Trump, uncertainty is built into the operating system. A week or so ago, he floated a 25% tariff on countries trading with Iran. It was discussed, it made headlines, but there has been no clear confirmation that it was ever operationalized in the way it was announced. That pattern, maximum public pressure, minimum administrative clarity, appears again here. So, when Trump says 10% tariffs on certain European states over Greenland, and when commentators begin calculating the damage, there is always the question, is this immediate policy, or is this coercive signaling designed to force European movement before the paperwork even lands? But let's assume, as we must for serious analysis, that Trump will make good on at least the core of what he threatens. In that case, Britain is not merely observing from the sidelines, it is directly exposed. A 10% tariff regime, if it bites, would hit sectors where Britain is especially vulnerable. One obvious example is the British motor industry, which is already a pale shadow of what it once was. Jaguar, Land Rover, and Range Rover in particular depends heavily on the U.S. market. If you constrain that access with tariffs and uncertainty, you do not just dent profits. You threaten the viability of one of the last globally recognizable British manufacturing brands. And yet Starmer has been conspicuously absent from the factory floor, conspicuously quiet in public, conspicuously unwilling to speak as a government defending domestic industry against an external shock. That tells you everything you need to know. London's priority is not industrial protection. London's priority is not Denmark. London's priority is Washington. Meanwhile, across the Northwest European media space, you read endless speculation about Europe's devastating counteraction. There is talk of activating the EU's anti-coercion mechanism, originally framed as a tool to resist Chinese economic pressure. There is talk of delaying ratification of the humiliating trade arrangement Ursula von der Leyen negotiated with Washington and showcased with Trump in Scotland. The fact that the treaty is not ratified already speaks volumes. There is internal European resistance because the deal was lopsided and everyone knows it. But the deeper lesson is even more embarrassing for Europe. That agreement, regardless of whether it is delayed now, was a snapshot of the true balance of power. Washington dictates. Europe pleads and rationalizes. Then you hear the most reckless fantasy of all, closing down or restricting U.S. bases. I continue to see this as mostly hot air. A few European politicians will flirt with it because it sounds dramatic and sovereign. But the practical consequences would be catastrophic and, more importantly, it would split Europe instantly. There is no unified European will to confront the United States on security, none. If anything, the last 4 years have proved the opposite. Europe has internalized its dependence and is terrified of living without American protection, intelligence, and logistics. So these threats are performed more for domestic audiences than for Washington. Trump, for his part, shows no sign whatsoever of backing down. He has posted again that the United States has been telling Denmark for 20 years to protect Greenland from Russia, and Denmark allegedly has done nothing, therefore the United States must move in and take over Greenland. This is nonsense on its face, but it is politically effective nonsense because it wraps a raw territorial demand in a security narrative. And Trump has now reinforced the fundamental point in an interview. When asked whether some arrangement short of annexation leases, concessions, special rights, mining privileges, basing expansions could satisfy him, his answer was no. He says that to secure Greenland and exploit it properly, you need possession, legal and physical possession. In other words, he is not negotiating for access, he is demanding ownership. This is crucial. It means that all the clever European ideas, let's offer expanded mining rights, let's offer long-term leases, let's offer additional U.S. basing permissions are not solutions. They may have worked on a conventional American administration that still cared about appearances and legal camouflage. With Trump, the demand is the demand. He wants the headline, Greenland becomes American territory. Full stop. And Trump is not isolated inside Washington. Senior figures are amplifying him, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Speaker Mike Johnson, others. Yes, there is some pushback. Some members of Congress are uncomfortable. Two Republican congressmen reportedly plan to join a delegation traveling to Greenland and have criticized aspects of Trump's posture. But this opposition does not look robust. I do not see Congress moving serious resolutions that would materially constrain Trump or signal iron support for Denmark. There is no real institutional resistance, no decisive political line in the sand. And I find that unsurprising, for a reason that many Europeans refuse to say out loud. In U.S. politics, arguing against a policy that expands America is not a comfortable position for many politicians, especially if it is framed as national security, rare earths, Arctic strategy, and keeping China and Russia out. Now add another layer. Trump's letter to Norway's Prime Minister, which was circulated to European ambassadors in Washington, meaning the administration did what it needed to do to ensure it would leak. And it leaked. The letter is revealing, not because it is elegant, it is not, but because it shows the psychology. Trump still carries an enormous grievance about the Nobel Peace Prize. He claims he stopped 8 wars and therefore deserved the prize, and he resents not receiving it. I've said before, and I'll say again, it is astonishing that a U.S. president, leader of the most powerful state on earth, would be so personally preoccupied with an award that has become, in practice, an empty political ornament. But Trump's resentment makes sense in one way. He watched Barack Obama receive the prize early in his presidency, absurdly and without merit, and Trump's loathing of Obama is well documented. So yes, I suspect the grudge is partly symbolic, a wound to ego, a wound to narrative. But what makes this episode uglier is what Trump implies, that his pursuit of peace was, at least in part, transactional, something he did expecting personal glorification. And when he didn't get it, he says peace becomes less important than before. He claims he will not abandon peace entirely, as if we should be grateful, but from now on he will focus narrowly on U.S. interests and ignore European opinion. And here is the important part. The letter is not really for Norway. It is for Europe. The message is blunt. I don't care what you think. I will do what I want. The Europeans have spent years telling themselves that America is a partner and that the alliance is built on shared values. Trump is stripping away the costume. The alliance, in his view, is an instrument. And when the instrument stops serving him, or when he decides it can be used more aggressively, he uses it. So where does this go? My conclusion remains the same. Trump will get what he wants, Greenland. The only real variable is the mechanism. He still uses the language of purchase. And that matters because it provides a veneer of legitimacy for American domestic consumption and offers European leaders a face-saving script. We negotiated a deal. We avoided conflict. We protected stability. But do not confuse the script with the reality. Any negotiation will be between profoundly unequal parties. Washington holds the leverage. Denmark does not. And all this chatter about Denmark extracting $800 billion for Greenland is fantasy. If money changes hands at all, I would not be surprised if it is tokened by the standards being thrown around an amount designed to buy compliance, not to fairly value territory. And this is not only my view. Others have argued the same point. Thomas Fawzi has written that sooner or later Europe will hand over Greenland because the power imbalance is too great. Wolfgang Münchau has followed with a related argument. You can draw a neat line around the countries Trump has targeted: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Britain, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Europe's liberal northwest. But NATO has many other members who have not been sanctioned, and they will not sacrifice their relationship with Washington over Arctic ice and distant geography. Italy is not going to rupture ties with the U.S. over Greenland. Spain and Greece will not. Eastern Europe certainly will not. Viktor Orban's Hungary will not. Slovakia will not. Even Poland, despite its pro-EU government, will not burn the U.S. alliance for Denmark. And the Baltic states, catastrophically vulnerable and psychologically dependent, will do everything possible to prevent any European move that fractures NATO. Even within the sanctioned 8, there will be factions, especially in Britain, Germany, Finland, Sweden, arguing that Europe cannot afford an open breach with the United States, because Europe, as the last 4 years have demonstrated, is not built to defend itself if it truly believes Russia is a threat. That is the bitter irony. Europe has talked itself into a permanent fear narrative, and that narrative becomes a chain around its own neck. Whether or not the fear is justified, the fear becomes politically binding. But economics is the real noose, not speeches. There is one switch Trump can throw that would bring Europe to heel far faster than any tariff exchange or trade instrument theatrics. LNG. Europe now critically depends on American LNG to keep what remains of its industrial base functioning, especially after deliberately cutting itself off from cheap Russian pipeline gas and moving to phase out Russian LNG as well. Some commentators note that U.S. LNG business dynamics are complicated, that parts of the industry were once unprofitable, that Europe's purchases stabilize profits, that Europe is effectively subsidizing American producers. Fine. Even if that's true, it does not change the strategic asymmetry. For the U.S., LNG disruption is painful, but not existential. Washington can subsidize, redirect, manage. For Europe, a serious LNG interruption would risk not deindustrialization but industrial collapse, particularly in the middle of winter. We already see the accelerating bankruptcy of local governments in Germany as tax bases erode with industrial shutdown. Turn the energy screws tighter and you move from decline to crisis. And this is where I want to say something very plainly, because Europeans are still resisting the obvious conclusion. Europe had options, real options 10 years ago. Europe had stable energy supplies. Russia never held a total monopoly. At peak, Russia supplied a significant portion of Europe's gas, but not total dependence, and Europe had room to diversify gradually, rationally, without turning energy into a moral crusade. Instead, Europe chose the most extreme and self-punishing course: weaponize everything, sanction everything, cut everything, and then pretend that dependence on the U.S. would be safer than interdependence with Russia. They exchanged a predictable supplier that did not use energy as coercion against Europe for a supplier with a long global record of coercion and economic warfare. And then they acted surprised when coercion arrived. This is why I keep coming back to the same judgment. Europe brought this on itself. By pursuing a single-track hostility to Russia for at least a decade and by shaping its entire foreign policy around that obsession, Europe destroyed relations not only with Russia but gradually with everyone else. India and the Gulf states are bored by European lectures. Turkey plays its own game. China has been provoked and alienated as Europe sacrifices economic modernization to please Washington. Europe bows to the United States at the expense of its own interests, and it gains neither respect nor reciprocity. Chinese commentary has been unusually scathing about Europe's double standards and strategic stupidity, expanding security concepts to justify politically motivated economic restrictions, pressuring member states to remove Chinese equipment, undermining scientific reasoning and market logic, and then acting helpless when America treats European territory like a bargaining chip. China's analysis is self-interested, of course, but it is not wrong on the central point. If you voluntarily place yourself in a position of total dependence, you cannot blame anyone but yourself when that dependence is exploited. So yes, I expect Europe will cave, and sooner rather than later. February, March, somewhere in that window. Especially as Davos becomes a stage for European pleading and American humiliation. European leaders will rush to Davos to chase Trump. They will seek a formula that lets them claim they protected sovereignty while quietly conceding the substance. I doubt they will move Trump. If he backs off, he will return to the demand within weeks, because the appetite grows with the eating. Greenland, today, tomorrow, perhaps another strategic necessity. And I shudder to say it, but Iceland is the obvious future candidate: small, independent, culturally rich, and strategically located. Now, even while Trump is bullying Europe over Greenland, he is simultaneously opening doors to the one partner Europe cannot stand seeing him engage: Russia, and specifically Vladimir Putin. Trump's officials have reportedly signaled that they want Putin to join a new peace board Trump is setting up, initially framed around Gaza. Whatever one thinks of this concept, it appears increasingly detached from Gaza's realities. There is no full ceasefire. Casualty numbers since the supposed ceasefire began are still severe. Aid flows remain contested. There is talk of other bodies' executive structures for Gaza, still nebulous, still unclear. And yet Trump is assembling a club. Erdogan, Milei, El-Sisi, Tony Blair, figures of very different reputations and agendas, and now Putin is invited too. Governments can join by paying $1 billion for the privilege, which tells you the whole thing has elements of spectacle and transactional branding. But what matters is not whether the peace board becomes a functional institution. What matters is the signal. Trump is again giving Putin a seat at a table, and Europeans are not automatically included. That alone enrages European elites because it contradicts the entire logic of Project Ukraine, which was designed to isolate and weaken Russia, to split Russia from China, and to force Moscow into a subordinate position. Instead, Russia is being courted, consulted, and in Trump's peculiar way treated as a power that must be dealt with. And there is another piece. In Davos, US, figures Kushner, Witkoff are expected to meet Kirill Dmitriev of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. If Dmitriev is able to be there, then either sanctions do not apply in the way many assume or arrangements have been made. In either case, the symbolism remains. Europe is scrambling to confront Trump, while America's representatives are comfortable talking to Russians in Switzerland. That is the hierarchy made visible. The Europeans will hate that. They will call it undermining unity. They will mutter about legitimizing Putin, but the truth is simpler. Europe no longer decides the frame. Washington does. The Russians, meanwhile, are watching this transatlantic quarrel with a mixture of amusement and strategic satisfaction, and yes, they are stirring the pot. When Mark Rutte used the absurd daddy language about Trump, Russian voices mocked Europe. Be careful not to annoy daddy. Kirill Dmitriev himself jabbed at the Europeans using exactly that theme. The Russians also circulate commentary flattering Trump's Greenland ambitions, effectively egging him on. If you resolve Greenland, you will go down in history as the president who expanded America like Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. This is classic Russian mischief. They do not need Greenland. They have no rational interest in it. But if the U.S. humiliates Europe, fractures European cohesion, and exposes NATO's real power relations, that is a net gain for Moscow. After what Europe has done since 2014 interference, sanctions, escalation, and an attempt to use Ukraine as a strategic battering ram, why would Russia not enjoy watching Europe squirm under American pressure? Now let's shift to Ukraine, because while elites argue about Greenland, Ukraine continues to deteriorate, and the deterioration is starting to look systemic, not temporary. The blackouts continue. Kiev remains in critical condition. Other major cities, Dnipro, Odessa, are reportedly in dire straits. Whatever the precise technical details, the pattern is unmistakable. Sustained strikes, repeated infrastructure damage, cascading effects, and growing inability to stabilize the grid. One does not need to be a military engineer to see the strategic logic. When the energy system buckles, everything buckles. Industry, logistics, water pumping, heating, communications, social stability, political control. Ukraine can talk about resilience all day long, but resilience is not magic. It is material capacity, and that capacity is being eaten away. At the political level, Kyiv's internal stress is showing in ugly ways. There are reports unverified by me, but widely circulated, that Zelensky has elevated a ruthless figure, allegedly with a criminal reputation, into a senior position within the security apparatus. Some sources even claim this person's nickname in the criminal world is the Strangler. I cannot independently confirm the details, and I am careful about repeating allegations as fact. But the broader point stands regardless of the nickname. As regimes enter acute pressure, they recruit harder men, they centralize coercion, they harden the security state. That is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of fear. We also see more overt political conflict. Tymoshenko has reportedly delivered fiery parliamentary attacks, associating Zelensky's direction with far-right ideological currents. Zelensky has met with Zaluzhny, the former commander now serving as ambassador in London, an obvious potential rival. That meeting looks, to me, like Zelensky trying to neutralize threats as conditions worsen. When leaders begin managing rival centers of legitimacy inside a collapsing state, that is not normal politics. That is pre-fracture behavior. Militarily, the frontline story remains consistent. Russian pressure, incremental advances, Ukrainian exhaustion. The Russian Defense Ministry reports the capture of Pavlivka in the Zaporizhia direction, part of a cluster of villages northwest of Orikhiv, tightening control over supply routes and moving toward further operational objectives. There is also talk of Novo Pavlivka captured in Donetsk, another step in the broader push that points toward encirclement dynamics and the slow grinding logic Russia has applied for months. And I continue to ask the question that increasingly forces itself onto any honest observer. Are we approaching a moment when Russia transitions from grinding attrition into a larger operational blow, something that looks less like incremental pressure and more like a decisive phase? I do not claim insider certainty. The Russian General Staff does not brief me. But the convergence of patterns is suggestive: intensified strikes on energy and logistics, pressure in the north, including movement that brings Russian forces closer to Sumy, systematic targeting that undermines mobilization capacity, and political stress in Kyiv. If you wanted to prepare the ground for a wider offensive, especially along axes that could threaten major nodes, this is not an irrational way to do it. I have also received claims about the recent Oreshnik strike that are impossible for me to corroborate independently. One source asserts there was deliberate subterfuge, that Putin was furious about a drone attack near his Valdai residence where family members were allegedly present, and that Moscow decided on a hard response, that the West was led to expect a strike in Kyiv, only to be surprised by a strike elsewhere, and that Western personnel, Germans and French, it is claimed, were caught and killed. I cannot confirm this. I note that various analysts, including Scientific Voices, are examining the strike's characteristics. I am interested in their assessments, because speculation is cheap and physics is not. So I flag these claims as claims not as proven fact, while emphasizing the strategic atmosphere. Russia is signaling that escalation against Russian leadership or sensitive sites invites consequences, and Russia is increasingly confident that it can impose those consequences at times and places of its choosing. Now step back and look at the geopolitical context. Project Ukraine is in its last gasps. Western energy is draining away. The Americans began distancing themselves once it became clear Ukraine could not achieve its battlefield objectives, and once the deeper strategic goals crisis in Moscow, rupture between Russia and China were not materializing. This is not only about Trump's personality, it is structural. The enterprise failed, and Washington is not going to pour infinite resources into a failed enterprise, especially when it has other agendas, other theaters, and other domestic constraints. Europe would like to pretend it can carry the war alone. It cannot. The late 2025 arguments over seizing Russian assets were the clearest confession of European weakness. They were looking for money because they do not have enough. They also do not have enough weapons production. They also do not have enough political unity, and they do not have a coherent plan for military victory. Brave speeches are not plans. Ukraine itself is hitting the wall. Manpower replacement cannot keep up with losses. The economy is a wreck. Domestic production is a fraction of Russia's. And even if Washington wanted to return to 2022-2024 levels of assistance, it is not clear the stockpiles, production tempo, and political appetite exist to do so. Russia outlasted the West's initial surge of confidence. Russia outlasted Europe's moral grandstanding. Russia outlasted Ukraine's offensive cycles, Zaporizhzhia in 2023, Kursk in 2024, both of which ended disastrously. I see no credible path to a Ukrainian offensive in 2026 of the sort some Ukrainian commanders still speak about, especially while cities struggle with power and heat. So, yes, the Americans are distracted by Greenland, Iran, Venezuela, whatever else is on the board. None of these can substitute for Ukraine strategically, because a Ukrainian defeat will remain a world-shaping blow to Western credibility. But that is precisely why the West is trying to look away. There is a political instinct to shift the narrative before the scoreboard becomes undeniable. Russia, by contrast, is not shifting the narrative. Russia is writing the scoreboard. And here is the central conclusion I draw from all of it. We are not yet at the end, but we are moving toward the military conclusion of the war, one that ends in an unqualified Russian victory, with Russia dictating terms. That is not wishful thinking. It is the plain reading of relative industrial capacity, manpower dynamics, battlefield momentum, political cohesion, and energy reality. The Europeans are now learning, painfully, that their decade-long monomania hostility to Russia did not make them stronger. It made them dependent, brittle, and strategically childish. They burned bridges with Moscow, irritated Beijing, bored the global south, and then placed themselves under Washington's energy leverage. Now, when Washington squeezes them, they have no counterweight. They can threaten instruments and packages and mechanisms. Trump can threaten existential energy pressure. This is the West's reality. It is not a community of equals. It is a hierarchy. And when pressure rises, that hierarchy becomes visible. Russia understands hierarchy. Russia understands power. Russia understands endurance. And after everything Europe has done after sanctions, seizures, propaganda, attempts to isolate and dismantle Russia, Moscow is now watching Europe get treated the way Europe helped America treat others for decades. Moscow has every reason to savor the moment and every reason to quietly let the transatlantic system corrode itself from within. Because in the final balance, the more the West fractures, the less capable it becomes of sustaining long wars of choice on Russia's borders. And that brings us to the strategic bottom line. Russia did not need to conquer Greenland to win in the Arctic. Russia did not need to invade Europe to prove its strength. Russia simply needed to remain what it is, a sovereign power with strategic patience, industrial depth, and the will to fight for its interests, while its adversaries exhausted themselves through arrogance and self-harm. That is where things stand today. And unless Europe performs a miracle, it has shown no capacity for strategic realism, diplomatic repair, energy rationality, and political independence, then the trajectory will not change. The West will keep talking, Russia will keep advancing, and the war, which began as a Western project to weaken Russia, will end as a demonstration that Russia's endurance and strategic clarity outmatch the West's slogans and improvisations.